What if the war for Earth wasn't fought with bullets, but with dreams? In today's episode, I'm joined by Andrew Najberg, the author behind Extinction Dream, a bleak and cerebral sci-fi horror novel where memory is fragile, reality is unreliable, and the enemy is never seen. We dive into the architecture of fear, the morality of obedience, and what it means to be human when even your thoughts can betray you. If you'd like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/The Dark Mind Podcast and become a member. Subscribers get exclusive daily blog posts, in-depth weekly reviews of books and films, and a narrative fiction story every week produced and narrated by me, Vincent Midgard. Your support doesn't just help the show, it keeps the dark conversation alive. So without further ado, I give you Andrew Najberg. Andrew, welcome back to the show.
Hey, man. How's it going? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Anytime, sir. Thank you for joining me on this 25th day of June 2025. I am always drawn to the dark beauty of your speculative fiction, and with Extinction Dream, you've outdone yourself. The scorched world of war is bleak and visceral, but it's the quiet horror of telepathic invasion, the erosion of thought, and the hijacking of self that truly haunts. So thank you for letting me step into that dreamscape with an early copy and for joining me on the show to discuss it.
Oh, man. No, seriously, thank you so much for taking the time to read it. I'm really proud of this one, and I'm extremely excited to have this one out. I absolutely appreciate you sitting down with it.
And so complex, so detailed, so technical. I actually feel like my IQ has jumped since reading it. At least 5 points.
I got a lot of figurative nosebleeds while reading this one, or while writing. I literally would just be sitting there staring at the cursor, just scratching my head, and it gave me a headache at times. I'll say it was the most difficult book that I've ever written, including the two I've written since that haven't come out yet. While I think I'm proud of them, this one I think is something special to me. I think it's the best that I could have put out.
Exactly. And I mean, even just right off the bat, the title, Extinction Dreams, just hits you really hard.
Yeah, it's better than any of the working titles I went through.
Oh, can you give me one?
It was actually mostly written under the title of Tether.
Tether. Oh, well, that's not bad.
It makes sense. You read the book, you'll see exactly how that falls in, but it doesn't have a lot to it, It's kind of a flat sounding word. And so, when Extinction Dream kind of came out one day, I was just like, yeah, I think that's it. I felt good about it since. And then it just, I started mentioning it to people to see, to kind of sound test it. It just got immediate reactions. And I was like, all right, this is the name.
Yeah, you were, I'm sure, going off the immediate reaction instead of what came after contemplation. You're like, no, I'm not interested in what you think about it. I want to see the immediate visceral reaction.
Exactly. Well, I mean, titles are like covers in that way, right? It's the whole point is to sort of get the head to turn just a little bit, or to get the eyes to widen just a little bit. If you've done that, then it's done its job, and the rest of the book's going to be what does the rest of it. So,
indeed. Well, so the book is about a soldier named Markus who is stationed aboard what was supposed to be a routine orbital research facility, but he quickly discovers he's been drafted into a war no one on Earth even knows is happening. And alongside his squad, he stands as one of humanity's last defenses against an invisible alien force that doesn't strike with ships or weapons, but with dreams. Twisting their fears into mental invasions, the enemy wages war through nightmares, leaving the soldiers unable to trust even their own minds. And no one has seen the enemy, and no one knows their purpose. All they know is this: Earth is losing, and that is where the story begins. So, in Chapter 1, we find that Markus has been sent on an assignment known as, they just kind of say, orbital. The verbiage that I'm using may be incorrect, but I kind of envision it as a platform stationed in space where only those deployed truly know what happens. So he initially believes it to be a research station, but soon discovers he's been thrust into an active combat zone, one where the aggression comes not through conventional warfare, but through telepathic attacks. And the idea of telepathic attacks is both surreal and deeply invasive. What led you to explore psychological warfare on such an intimate level?
Well, there's a couple different things. Admittedly, some of the premise of this was inspired by Cixin Liu's three-body problem, and in a very indirect way. I read that book, and I think it's a phenomenal piece of science fiction. And one thing that really struck me about it is, in the last third of the book, Liu spends a substantial amount of time describing the idea of a 14-dimensional attack. And what really interested me on that was that, when we think of, what fighting is and what combat is, we think of it typically in science fiction in very human terms. We sort of imagine engaging with an enemy in the way we'd engage with our enemies here on the planet. And, to me, my idea was, well, if we want to create an alien war that I think is going to be a realistic alien war, that war is going to be fought, or it could be fought on terms that are wholly different than anything we'd understand war to be. And so one of the things I wanted was, I want there to be this possibility, and this is one of the things that sort of built around the story. I want there to be the possibility that these characters could be at war and not even know they were experiencing a war. Once they're up there, of course, they're plunged much more directly into it. But, the concept or the foundation of the horror, I think, is the idea that, you could be fighting for your lives against an aggressor at any time without having any way to differentiate whether it was just your own thoughts and fears coming to the surface, or you were suffering from an attack. And then from there, I extended this into a more traditional battle line image of soldiers stationed in a base, prepared to meet this kind of onslaught. Then from there, of course, I've always been really fascinated with questions of cognition and consciousness and the relationship between that and reality. And so, I also did tilt that, of course, into, themes that I find to be my particular strengths and stuff that I really like to explore. Because if I'm not having fun when I'm thinking it through, I would wonder whether or not anybody else would be really engaged with the concept.
And so help me kind of paint a picture here. When they're, I guess, in combat mode, so to speak, they're in these small pods, they're in zero gravity, so strapped down, so they're not floating away, surrounded by multiple screens?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and bank of 14 screens.
Now, do they ever see anything that indicates that they're being engaged by a human or alien-like craft in a traditional sense of warfare? Or is it always these graphic, nightmarish hellscapes that kind of get purged at them?
No, they have not seen the enemy in any physical representation that they are aware of. That doesn't mean they haven't in a form or another, but to their knowledge, nothing that they would recognize as a traditional alien craft, as a traditional alien creature, none of that has been directly registered. Instead, one thing we see in Markus's internal narration as he's sitting there waiting for this attack is he's watching his environment. looking for minor cues of disruption. So he's looking for flickers in the screens, tiny, he's listening for sounds, and the soldiers who are on the mic with him, they're all in their own pods, they're all speculating on what these triggers might be, what the people in command might be watching for. And part of the horror of that opening is that, in a lot of ways, while they're surrounded by this, clearly advanced level of technology, they're ultimately meant to be these soft, vulnerable little chunks of meat strapped into these seats with no idea. I was kind of inspired to some extent by some of those early photos of animals in space, like, chimpanzees and things, that, they had to be existentially terrified simply to be in the situation they were. And that itself was is a driving fear, I think, of this particular war.
So when they're, I forget how they were notified that a threat was coming. What were they notified, or was it simply those triggers they got in their mind?
So in the opening, in the first sequence, Markus sees one of the screens activate. And so at that point, and this is something you learn pretty early in the narrative, at that point, what's happening is he's being attacked by this telepathic assault, and it's being technologically deflected onto that screen to try to create a buffer between him and what's being put into his mind. We also learn very quickly through that mantra of stage one on the screen, stage two in the mind, that these attackers are growing increasingly adept at overriding that buffer and then returning the attack into the minds of the soldiers. Now, we do see in a later combat episode that, and this is also referenced in that first one, but not as directly, that there is this figure who's in what's called the God chair, who is sort of the squad commander overseeing the direct engagement, but perhaps from more of a technical side. And he is able to give warnings and indications when they think somebody might be about to be the subject of an attack.
Gotcha. And I remember a piece in the book where it's almost like it's a liability or a handicap to have a family if you're in the mafia, because it can be used against you. Well, at the same time, since this story takes place in the context of psychological warfare, they're told not to think about, their wives, their families at home, because anything they bring to the surface of their consciousness can be twisted and used against them. And I don't know if it's a spoiler or not to reveal that the images of these family members and loved ones can be turned against them into these really graphic scenes of violence.
No, I definitely don't think it's a spoiler. I mean, you see, Markus in his first attack in chapter 1. So you do start to get some very early examples of that. Of course, you get more dramatic and severe stuff later in the book. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I really wanted to do in this piece is I really wanted to go all out with the emotional horror of the narrative. Part of the reason why is, when you're working in science fiction as a medium, you have a distancing effect from the text and to the reader created by the layers of technology, by the world building you have to do, where they have to process this new additional history, these new cultural elements, the changes in how day-to-day life looks. And so you're putting all of these little barriers between you and the reader's emotional register and their ability to relate and connect. And then similarly, you have people who are engaged with a war against an alien species, something that, nobody I know of can legitimately claim to have participated in. And as a result, there is a particular urgency, I think, to forge effective and strong emotional connections with the reader and the characters. And so, I wanted to be able to bring in a wide gamut of sources of more familiar emotional urgency, and using the idea of, one's family and loved ones as something that can be turned against you, not because they're being threatened, but because your love for them is being used against you internally, I thought would be a really strong way to make people, feel the disquiet and discomfort that Markus does every time he goes to strap himself into his pod.
Now, you touch on free will subtly, the characters question whether what they're feeling or doing is truly their own. So how is free will affected and or exploited in these attacks? And actually, not only in the attacks, but kind of in the way they are, I don't know, it's like they're kept in this claustrophobic nightmare where information of what they're doing and why they're doing it is withheld from them. And even when they're talking to their loved ones on the phone, there's like this delay, like you're calling into a radio station so they can hit the kill switch if you say something you're not supposed to,
Well, so there's a number of ways to think about that in the story. I mean, first off, I'm a huge fan of paranoia narrative. And so, part of it is me, leaning towards tropes that I enjoy working with, that I think are going to make for an engaging sense of mystery. And, one of I think the defining traits of Extinction Dream is it actually does give you some very substantial answers to a lot of questions. There are a lot of mysteries introduced, but the narrative does sort of unfold those mysteries in fairly direct ways at times. One thing I did want to do, though, at the same time was to kind of create this sense of anxiety and paranoia where you both don't know who to trust, but you also understand that not trusting people is necessity. And so, they're being disarmed against themselves. They are their own greatest threat. And, that's one of those harder points to articulate about, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. And the reason why, of course, is, coming back to that question of free will and how that plays in, that's one, of course, I can't fully answer without massive spoilers of late narrative elements. But it is something that is a direct and intentional question through the piece, because the simplest way I can put it without getting too far into it is that, we are in many ways, forgetting the idea of choice, we are in many ways, we don't have will when it comes to our experience of time. We do plod steadily forward. Yeah, there's dilation of it and stuff like that. Somebody can get stoned and feel like, 1 hour is 4 hours. So, I mean, we have a little bit of leeway over affecting it, but otherwise we experience linear causality. And that is something that is not subject to any free will we would have, that we do something, we physically interact with the world, and that sets in motion a chain of events. And one of the things I wanted to do in the narrative is in a couple of key ways to sabotage or work against the notion of linear causality.
Well, this kind of harkens back to my earlier statement about having read the book. I felt like my IQ went up about 5 to 10 points. The station is covered in gimbals, clamps, cords, and the pods, which is really kind of disturbing, have the ability to be jettisoned with the occupants still inside if they hit the infamous stage 3. And if I was understanding right, once they are jettisoned, they're destroyed once they're at a safe distance? Like what, just thermite plasma burned or something like that?
Yeah, they're obliterated by a combination of plasma and ballistics.
And what's more, to add insult to injury, to maintain balance, releasing one pod requires releasing its exact opposite counterpart. Which, I mean, makes sense. It's as disturbing as it is. It makes sense. So did you diagram or mock up the layout of this space station in any way?
Yeah.
Can you show us?
I'm afraid not. I don't know where it is. Like if you saw the mountain of papers that is in this office out of camera frame, you'd understand. And that would be a multi-week project, not just let me dig through for a few minutes. It's deep. But I did actually have a working diagram of the station. It was one of the more heavily researched parts of the narrative. Actually, I wanted it to work with established design principles and theoretical constructs for things like, creating centrifugal gravity or, mock gravity or whatever you'd want to call it. I wanted to make sure that I had things like the tension forces worked out so that, the basic layout of it is realistically buildable. But one thing that was also frustrating is why I really needed the diagram was this is one of those things that most people probably won't pay much attention to. But, when you're writing a piece in space, it's not like the whole station is spinning. It can't really, because, there's also other parts of the station that they move through as they go through the spokes. Making the spoke part of the design is the most structurally efficient construction method. And so, as you move closer to the center, your relationship to gravity changes. So parts of the station have no gravity, parts of the station, and of course this is gravity with quotation marks. I don't do artificial gravity because there's no physics for that. But, there's a different gravity when you're actually in the main, like the habitat module and stuff like that. Then also when you're in the spokes, gravity has a changing pull on you as you move through it. And all of these different gravitational pulls and dynamics were actually profoundly important to shaping the way in which tension unfolds in different parts of the station. So you end up with, for example, a chapter of a fairly prolonged journey down one of the conduits, and of course the conduit is sort of changing and shifting around Markus or within his perception. I was deliberately kind of charting his progress on the diagram to make sure that I knew how he was going to be interacting with gravity if he did have to do something at those different points of the journey. That was part of the absolute headache that was writing some of the segments here.
Yeah. So there were some places, from the centrifugal force I know it's kind of a semantics thing, but like something resembling gravity to where you were on the ground and you could, for the most part, walk around.
Yeah.
And then other areas, there were slings. You had to hook your feet onto things and...
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
So, I tried to do it as rationally as possible. Habitation module and the mess hall, they both had some measure of artificial gravity to them because, those are the places where it's going to be the most important, especially for, eating purposes. Your life is a whole lot easier if, you're not chasing down your food. But it also lets you move... Well, I honestly, I was tempted to actually incorporate that. But in the end, I just sort of left people to assume this is like ISS bathrooms. So even in the areas with gravity, you're probably not taking any chances and you're just going with the full suction system.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, within the story, you weave in a number of poetic and biblical references. Moloch, Mammon, Azazel, and there's a striking moment where a fellow soldier named Ford looks into a screen and is slowly blinded, echoing Milton's Guardian of the Sun. So were you using these allusions to hint the war being fought isn't just physical or psychological, but possibly moral or even metaphysical?
So first off, I will say that there absolutely was some direct play from Paradise Lost in here. I think to a certain extent, when you look at the dystopian world building of the narrative, there's definitely a sort of fall of man theme that runs throughout it. While we see this desperate war, we also do see events unfolding that suggest that, we're also simultaneously the instruments of our own destruction. And it's something that plays out significantly through the themes as well. And, as far as, thinking about moral and metaphysical implications are absolutely intended. I'll say that very guardedly that it does connect to some crucial information about the nature of the enemy or the antagonistic force. There is an element that pulls from some traditional questions of metaphysics, or perhaps I don't know what would be the best word, exotic physics. Thinking beyond the boundaries of the typical described and observable universe. As far as moral implications go, I don't want there to be sort of a uniform moral system. In fact, actually, one thing that there are a lot of biblical references. You see right away that the attackers have been nicknamed after biblical demons. But at the same time, one thing I do work to accomplish, and I hope succeed with, is a lot of different moral points of view are present, and I want them all to be equally competitive. I don't want it to lean into one or the other. Rather, to a certain extent, I guess, if anything, I'd say the point might be that they're all equally wrong in enough ways that it causes them problems.
Yeah. Well, in chapter 2, the violence in these scenes is mechanical, almost impersonal, just buttons, sequences, and hatches. So is that impersonality intentional? Were you making a point about how modern systems can sanitize or obscure human suffering?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's been an idea that I've been interested in for quite some time. And it's not even just human suffering. Almost every emotion can be sort of mechanized. And don't get me wrong when I say this, because I'm not actually criticizing people's goodwill in the process. You see things like, the people crowdfunding for help, for example. There's the part of you that's like, your heart's warmed that, people are coming together in a way to be able to help people who are really struggling. And it's fantastic that those people find the help that they're looking for. But at the same time, you still have two substantial problems that are arising from it. One is that, you have this issue of the fact that that help is necessary. There probably should be more robust systems in place for people who legitimately fall upon crisis. I think in a perfect world, we'd have a stronger net to catch people. But that being said, I also do think that there are a lot of people who will sort of donate to this kind of thing. And then they'll be like, oh, okay, I've done my moral duty for the month. They feel like they've contributed something. And, it's sort of this almost moral relief of the burden of being human where, we can, at the checkout, they ask you if you want to donate that extra 13 cents to the children's hospital. And,
I round up, but it's just because I OCD.
No, I do it sometimes for sure. And then other times you don't. And you always feel, you get this like weird little guilty feeling about it. But, the thing is that there isn't an impersonal nature to it. You have no idea who you're helping and why. And that's not a bad thing. Don't get me wrong. But I do think that, part of our interaction with other people benefits from, direct interaction of, having that real engagement where, we know who we've helped. Then we see it in much more human individual terms. We start to value the individual rather than the act. And there is a little bit of commentary in there, but then also even more so when it comes to war. I find the prospect of modern warfare just abjectly terrifying. I don't know if you've seen the videos from the Ukrainian battlefront when drones start coming for Russian troops, and some of the Russian troops just blow their brains out. They shoot themselves rather than face what's coming. And then you see the videos of the drone operators, and there are these people who are just sitting in chairs like we are right now, and they've got goggles
completely
on.
Disconnected.
Absolutely. How can you possibly feel the gravity of what you're doing when you're on 100 miles away in a bunker or 1,000 miles away across an ocean? It's interesting because this is person to person combat now. This is a single person flying a drone to attack a singular additional target. So this is person to person, but it's so disconnected. I don't know how anybody would feel the reality of their actions with that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's probably I think that they do feel it, but it's got to be this strange form of cognitive dissonance that just eats away at them like under the surface, You're there and can see it happen. You can see the result of where your bullet or your bomb goes. That's one thing. Disconnected from it, though, even though you can't hear it, even though you probably only see something resembling like a big green flash, that, there's probably children in that thing I just blew up, and it's got to just slowly like creep into your psyche. I bet there's a lot of people that fly drones that, end up with drinking problems and,
The thing is I bet you, those people are going to suffer effects from this years down the road that we can't even possibly predict. We have no idea what this is going to do, I think, in the long run, especially, en masse. Maybe there's some prototypical forms of this, in the last 20, 30 years. The cruise missile strikes are also kind of impersonal, but they don't have that same person to person violence that the drone attacks can, where you literally see that single person that you're going to be about to kill, and you're literally directing towards that person.
Yeah.
I mean, what does that actually do? I mean, do we have any long-term studies of what the 20-year psychological profile from that is?
So you're saying that the videos you're talking about, you can actually see single people. It's not just some aerial attack where they're just dropping a bomb on a generalized area.
I mean, I've seen some of the drone footage where they see individual people, where basically you get to see the camera feed of the drone, and they see very specific targets. It's not just a nebulous building, at least as far as my understanding goes.
Yeah, that's dark.
Well, it isn't the most chipper of books, so it makes sense for conversation to take those turns.
Oh, well, this is the Dark Mind podcast. I'm not complaining.
That's true.
I was just making a statement like, yeah, that's dark. Well, circling back to the book, in chapter 3, you write about memory in a uniquely unstable way. Sometimes it's a comfort, sometimes a threat. How does memory function in this world where reality is so easily manipulated?
So, memory as a concept is really central, I think, to the book, because, in a lot of ways, we understand ourselves as a composite of our memories. So it's an important part of the construction of ourselves. We also understand ourselves as a literal neurological construct of memories, where the thing that is us is this associative pattern where, one memory that we've deemed important links to 10 other memories. And, we know to some extent that if damage happens to one of those memories, through physical trauma or what have you, it does have a cascade effect on the memories around it. It does tend to ripple through. And then also similarly, when, let's say you have something like a stroke or some other damage to your brain, as your brain sort of reconstructs itself, it starts building new tangential pathways, relinking those, memories to other memories and starting to bring these new sort of identity paths out of it. Then also, finally, we do understand that memory itself, while it's kind of fascinating, really, because, we sort of see ourselves as the composite or perhaps an amalgam of these memories. But we also know that our memories are not only unreliable, but they are also malleable. That, sort of a classic example would be to, if you were to imagine like one of your real memories, and then, let's say it's like a teenage memory from, some class that you hated. And then you just picture yourself writing a note and passing it to the person next to you. And you intend, that part's invented though. You don't really, that's not the memory. You just picture yourself doing that in that memory. And if you do that enough times over a couple of months, your brain is going to start losing track of whether or not that memory is real or not. Eventually, it may actually become one of your perceived as real memories, no longer distinguishable from something you've entirely made up. And literally, you can invent conversations in memory. You could invent actions and things that you've done. You can make up an entire day of your life just by playing games with your memory, just tinkering with it, tweaking it step by step, and then repeat. And that's something that I think is, really central to this story is, if we anchor ourselves in the reality of our lived experience, what happens when, we start seeing new variations, of that lived experience that are close enough to be real, but then also changed enough to be disturbing. How much repetition would it take to start distorting the actual authentic memory at the core?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so fallible. Like, I hate the fact, it used to be what was the bellwether of what you could send somebody to jail with was eyewitness testimony. That is some of the worst fucking testimony.
Oh, absolutely.
And, like me and my wife have inside jokes from movies we've watched where we repeat a line over and over, and then you go back and watch the movie like, oh, he didn't really say it like that. He actually said it just a tiny bit differently. It's not as funny now,
Well, I mean, there's the classic, Luke, I am your father. Collectively as a culture, tons of people remember that as the line, but it's never actually said in those exact words.
How is it said?
I think it's just, no, I am your father. Yeah, he doesn't preface it with Luke. People just inserted that to sort of create the context with a single word Q, and then it's now embedded in cultural memory.
Yeah, even in other shows, like I think Family Guy made fun of it. Stuff like that. They always say, "Luke, I am your father." Yeah,
absolutely. And of course, what's the name for that Mandela effect?
Yeah, the Mandela effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's the root of it. Of course, is shifts of collective consciousness through repetition and through shared mistakes.
Like politicians memory holing things. Yeah. Yeah. Just kind of not to go off in the weeds here. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it, but just out of curiosity, like what's the best book that you've read on consciousness? Because I'm kind of perusing an old one, Consciousness Explained by Daniel Dennett.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, honestly, my favorite's pretty classic. It's, Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulations. It's not overtly on consciousness. It's more about perception and reality. But it's, he's the one who coined the term of the hyperreal, building on a couple of previous models like the facsimile map by Jorge Luis Borges. But, basically the idea is that if you and everyone around you convinces yourselves that something is real, and then that's a fabrication, and then you eliminate any evidence of the actual reality, is there any way for the fabrication to be uncovered? It's kind of like also the idea at the core of one of my favorite movies, John Carpenter's The Thing. Where how do you distinguish a perfect imitation? And of course the film itself sort of creates this interesting but also fairly clumsy mechanism of the each cell being alive and trying to react. But in principle, how would you recognize a perfect imitation that wasn't yours? Like if somebody broke into your house and they replaced your pillow with a pillow identical to it, would you ever know? Would there be any way of ever knowing that wasn't your pillow? Or would you just go to bed that night and fall asleep on your pillow? And then, a couple of days later, you'd change the pillowcase on your pillow, as far as you're concerned anyways, and anybody else So at what point would it now be your pillow? Because if you do that for long enough, even though it's not the same pillow you think it was, you've been thinking about this version of it in those exact same terms. You've had the same relationship to it ever since. At some point, it becomes the thing you think it is. And I don't know, I'm pretty fascinated by the nature of an assignability of identity. So,
yeah.
And pillow thieves.
Pillow thieves, yes, even more so. Well, in the way Markus reflects on the military recruitment process, you draw a sharp contrast between the promised future, bonuses, retirement, space travel, and the brutal reality of orbital war. So was this sense of disillusionment intended to parallel any real-world military recruitment narratives? Because it's kind of a weird thing I like to do. I don't know if you do it or have noticed it in passing. Like, have you ever watched, I guess any of them, but specifically the Army's recruitment videos, how they change according to kind of the zeitgeist of the time?
Oh, no, absolutely. That is 100% a jab at recruiting processes. I teach for University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and about once a year, the Army shows up on campus to do a recruitment thing, and it always pisses me off. Not because, I honestly don't have an objection to military service. I have plenty of friends who are in the military and things like that. I mean, it's it's somebody's choice, and if they want to do it, and I'm granted I'm not the biggest fan of war, as you can probably tell from most of my books, I don't portray it well. But at the same time, I get the idea. So the thing that bothers me though is these Army recruiters. They show up with these giant trailers. They basically have Xbox first-person shooter video games that they build team games to play with the students. They have little games and sports equipment with them. They give out free drinks and stuff like that and snacks, and it's just. And they sort of sell it as this refreshing, fun party. And that seriously pisses me off. I understand that they do have to make it, they're not going to like show them like a really, really harsh footage taken inside an active war zone of a soldier, like, who's just had their legs blown off staring at their stumps. I get that they're not going to do that. But I also think that, trying to create the sense that, you're just, it's a fun Friday in the fields. That kind of propaganda doesn't sit well with me. And so, I took a pretty good jab at that by, they're selling comfort. And in the case of the world of Extinction Dream, of course, I do take it a slightly larger step where, they're being recruited with also just necessities. They want air conditioning. They want unlimited water. I don't see it as a big stretch to take that kind of propaganda selling comfort and pleasure as a recruitment tool to these are the things you need to survive, and this is the only way you get them is if you fight.
Yeah, see, that's something I didn't like about your dystopia was the heat. I like the whole cyberpunk really cold, always raining, thing. And you're talking about like this intense heat. I'm like, no, no, but no, that actually made it that much more intense because, I mean, aside from the heat, you've got a water shortage. I mean, people are signing up for the military just so they can get water. And I remember something, this might be a spoiler, but something about a nuclear winter. Bring on the nuclear winter.
No, of course, the specter of nuclear war does, loom over everything, as it does right now. And so that is sort of an anchor point that I wanted to build off of. Also, in sort of a sidelong way, it kind of connects it potentially a little bit to Galatok's world as well. That's one thing that those two worlds do have a little bit in common with. But no, a lot of the more hotly contested areas in the world right now, and the ones that are likely to see more difficulty also tend to be, spectacularly hot, and they're only seem to be getting hotter. And, I really wanted to work, again, with some elements of my Croatian background. And so I did want to set a portion of the narrative in Croatia. And, there's only so much you can realistically cool down Croatia during the summer, which would be the time people would want to visit it, especially for natural attractions like in the story. So, my idea was that I wanted to make this sort of almost paradisical image, fairly Edenic image. What's going to be the best way to make that, uncomfortable for people to inhabit? And just ratcheting up the heat seemed to be the most natural way because, Croatia gets really hot to begin with.
Does it?
It's a dry but pretty intense heat during the summer.
Wow.
And when you crank that up by about 5 to 7 degrees, it's survivable. That's the thing is, it would be survivable, but it would also be difficult.
Abject misery.
Exactly. And, I wanted to create this sort of pervasive feel that survival is difficult. Survival is not easy. And even when their lives are at their best, it's either because, something, unusual has happened or they've given up something to get it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as we're kind of talking about the dystopian elements, you've got artificial flowers that still produce oxygen, never-ending war, total surveillance, moderated speech. Was there a particular event in the world of your story that kind of triggered the dystopian landscape?
Not especially, to tell you the truth. A lot of it does sort of stem from something that happened that you learn about later in the story that, is referenced early on in the narrative. And I won't get into the details of the particulars because I don't want to spoil it, but there is something referred to as, the Kasagi incident throughout the narrative. And to some extent, the nature of that narrative and the nature of the way in which the alien attackers interact with our reality does have to do with at least some of the pervasiveness of the surveillance state. They have a very specific motive at the start of the narrative and before to be able to sort of pinpoint individual identities and data. I can't say more than that without getting into heavy spoilers. Exactly. But no, beyond that though, I don't want it to seem like the Kasagi incident is that happens and they're like, oh, we need to surveil everybody. What I want it to feel more like is that there's sort of this more organic surveillance state of data gathering that has emerged over time, and then the incident happens and now it's focused and now it becomes a more direct and, for lack of a better word, punishing application of it.
Gotcha. Well, in Chapter 5, you evoke imagery of the Challenger and other failed launches. So how do real-world space disasters factor into the emotional and thematic backdrop of your fictional military space program?
So, I think innovation is oftentimes forged through failure. And that's something I actually don't really see stopping here. In fact, actually, looking at the whole scope of the narrative, it is actually that military and space program's failures that actually shape the trajectory of the whole plot. And to a certain extent, failing and then trying to build from it is, it's an overarching theme of the book. I'll definitely say that specific space disasters, especially Challenger, were actually pretty formative in sort of creating the history of the program. It's sort of how I conceived, this what this Space Force would look like, how it would come to have the identity it does, and it's actually pretty core to the fabric.
Well, so how old were you? This is a Challenger question. How old were you when the Challenger incident happened, and were you watching it on TV in school?
Yeah. So I was 6 in first grade, and we were watching it live. We had just finished, and the day before, we'd had a special lesson. I'm blanking on her name now, but the teacher who was on the crew, she was like the first teacher in space or something like that. And we'd just had a lesson on her. And then she blew up. It was a really weird moment. And in a lot of ways, it is very much part of what informed a lot of my outlook in the book, which is that on the one hand, I was old enough to recognize that something terribly wrong had just happened, and the adults in the room were acting like something terribly wrong had just happened. But also, it happened on the TV, and it was this thing we were watching like it was a movie. And there was also this unreality to it as a result. These were people I had never met, because I was so young, I have a really vivid disconnect in that moment of both simultaneously recognizing something horrible was happening and that I was really upset by it, but then also understanding that I really didn't understand the gravity of it at all.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, that's sort of the feeling I wanted to pull through this whole book, is that there's that disconnect where Markus is just living his day-to-day life in one respect. He's just, he's pulling himself down these corridors and strapping himself into his sling to sleep and things like that. But then, also at the same time, his day-to-day life is just utterly horrific. And the things that he's normalized are things that nobody should have normalized. And I don't know, I feel like, especially now that we live in this sort of always filmed culture, the world itself is perpetually under camera, and we access it constantly through social media and the internet. And I feel like the things that get normalized in that kind of world probably shouldn't be. And, I'm not going to be somebody who's like, we need to stop the internet or something like that. But, I do think it's a really strange reality that we're in. It's existentially bizarre. And I really wanted to offer some commentary on it through the book, and then utilize it as a source of horror.
Yeah, I was exactly just like you, 6 years old, and I don't remember back in the 80s there was no flat screen. They wheel the TV.
Nope. We had a mounted TV.
Oh,
but it was a cube.
Frickin' duh. No, just like
but it was a cube.
It was a cube. Okay.
Yeah, it was like this fat.
Oh, I know what you're
TV.
talking about. Like up in the corner.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
I got you.
Yeah, that's what we were watching on. It was like this 13-inch screen, which at the time was actually like a normal size for a TV.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wish I could remember how the teachers reacted specifically, but what I do remember is I saw it going, and then I saw the smoke trail all the way up to the top, and there was nothing left. I remember thinking, I don't know anything about rockets. I don't know how this is supposed to go, but that doesn't look right. That looks like something bad happened. But I mean, that's NASA. Those are the smart people, the adults. They know what they're doing. And then, teachers and adults, they know what they're doing. So it wouldn't be like we just witnessed something bad happen. So I was confused. I was like, so what happened? I don't understand. Because it couldn't be something bad,
Mm-hmm.
It was weird. I had way too much trust in adults in society. Well, so circling back to the book, Markus has the spark of a love interest in a woman named Casper, but he's conflicted. Technically, he's still married, but he's pretty much fully aware he's likely going to die and never see his wife again. There's something transcendent about exploring that kind of a morally gray area. It almost feels like a Japanese koan, like something meant to challenge logic and reveal deeper truths. So how do scenarios like that affect you on a mental or psychological level as a writer? Like, what draws you to include them? And then as a result, like, how does it affect you?
Well, that's a tough one. I think to a certain extent, one of my goals with Markus was to was to humanize him. This is a really sterile environment. And one of my favorite lines from him actually comes early in the narrative, maybe chapter 4. It's after his first debriefing that we see with Dr. Gibbet. And, he's given the sucker at the end of it. And he, walks off eating it, feeling simultaneously childish, but he also thinks, we get so few good things, and I think that there is this idea that, we exist in a tension between our immediate selves and, our longer term understanding of ourselves. And one thing I really wanted to do was to, put in front of Markus both a combination of immediate good things and then also to have him have a larger moral backdrop. And I wanted to explore the tension between those things, and as a whole, as far as, why a relationship, a lot of the pleasures they get, there's a fight in the mess hall over candy bars, or their absence, more accurately. There's these, these lollipops that the station psychologist gives them. There's a couple other little things, like they think about, the small pleasures, but for the most part, they are really simple things. And so I needed to introduce something that would have sort of a larger emotional significance. And because of the nature of their duty, I don't have the opportunity to be able to immediately present him with things like, his nephews. That's not there. I can't have him, picking flowers with his mother on the station. It's just not going to happen. So a lot of the other emotional joys of life have been deprived. And so introducing Casper as sort of this potential romantic interest, was one of the ways I could create a more authentic and compelling emotional temptation for him.
Well, your characters are not just facing death, but actually the absence of meaning behind it. Were you exploring themes of absurdism or existentialism through this portrayal of warfare without clarity?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, by nature, I approach most of my writing out, through existential questions. I like to think that my books are fairly inquisitive in their approach, where you have characters who are grappling with some sort of big picture ideas. I don't want it to just be sort of, moment to moment conflict, but no, ultimately, as a whole. I do find that war by nature struggles to have meaning. I think that there are meaningful things that happen in war. But when we sort of step back and look at the broader tableau of it, it is absurd, especially in modern day. You did have older, ancient wars where, you have tribal conflicts over the only water supply or something like that, where people are fighting over a very fundamental existential survival. But in theory, overall, we do live in a world that is capable of supporting its population. We probably could take better care of it to make sure that it does so, but that's a whole nother conversation. But, we do live in a world where we have what we need to provide for everybody. And for one reason or another, we have not gone that route. We've decided to, establish the current sort of vista of societies and religions and belief systems and things like that. And to me, I find human life to be intrinsically valuable. I do think that it is something important. And so there is something absurd to me about just killing each other over wealth or resources, or because you hate somebody's culture or religion. I'm an existentialist by nature, as part of what drew me to writing poetry, actually. I'm very interested in trying to make meaning out of my interpretation of the world. I want to make the world mean something to me. And so I very similarly want to make sure that, my characters are faced both with that understanding that what they have around them is important, but that at the same time, it's always threatened and challenged by something that feels inherently absurd as war, especially against an enemy that you know nothing about.
Yeah. Well, you alluded to it before. The God Chair serves as the central command hub where decisions, and I think one of the main decisions that's made from that is ejecting the pods.
Yeah.
So it's described as something both feared and worshipped, a symbol of power, judgment, and removal. Is the God Chair meant to represent blind obedience, divine bureaucracy, or something else entirely?
So, in some ways, a combination of all of those. First off, contextually within the narrative, you have these soldiers. They're facing a bank of screens, and each screen is labeled with the name of a demon, and they're receiving instructions, and they know that their lives are subject to the arbitrary whim of something that they call the God Chair. And, they indicate very early in the narrative that they have no idea what the metrics are that would trigger the God Chair to launch or jettison their pods. So that to them, from their experience, there is something entirely arbitrary about it, that there is this sort of meaningless obedience. And it's not even actually really obedience, because they don't really have a choice. When they get jettisoned, because there's no warning, there's no genuine way they could try to prevent it from happening. The pods are locked. And so it is a way in which their free will is intentionally being stripped by the people who have orchestrated this defense system.
So there are hints of Earth's political landscape. You got Russia, China, the US, but the focus remains tightly on the station and its inhabitants. How much of the wider world did you build out mentally, even if it never made it to the page?
So a pretty decent bit, actually. I was actually growing up, I was a big fan of things like Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, and some of those old school political thrillers, The Bourne Identity and stuff like that. And I think it's fun to sort of speculate on and think through potential, geopolitical evolutions. And in this case, of course, this one was, let me see, I wrote this one in 2022 and into 23. And, at that point, we were starting to see, potential emergence. And then I think I wrote the second half of this after the Ukraine war had begun. So, I was already kind of seeing tension in that area. And, we'd already seen things like the Russian invasion of Crimea. So, the Black Sea was already sort of an operating conflictual theater. And, I sort of saw that as a potential central locus for, some of the sort of the planet's surface action, where I wanted to sort of tether things to reality. And, one of the things I was going for, I wanted to create a world that felt plausible, that felt like a not too distant future, that wasn't out of reach of where we are now, even if some of the technology, may be invented. So, yeah, building off of kind of contemporary tensions, I would have a hard time, for example, seeing, unless, of course, we all just blow each other up, I don't really see the tension between the U.S. and, the Soviet or former Soviet Union and China going away. They are the largest political players on the planet. It's possible that, civil war could strike one, or that one could fragment into smaller states or something. But ultimately, that wouldn't be writing, I think, for our audience now. Since this book is written for now, I wanted to make sure that it had echoes of where the world is now, just sort of cranked up to 11, or maybe more accurately, kind of notching up the thermostat a little bit to bring in that heat.
Yeah. Yeah, and don't be surprised if somebody in the tech or the possibly the defense contracting industry gets a hold of this book and actually makes something off of your concepts.
Oh, that would be unsettling for sure.
Well, I mean, as we've been talking about, you really went into some plausible detail and some very grounded concepts. I don't know. I think somebody might. Actually, no, nobody's going to do that. I mean, never mind.
That's why I've buried the plans.
Okay, got you. Yeah, they're going to be shredded as soon as you get offline with me. I got it. All right. Well, kind of speaking of the darker aspects of the story, was there an emotional cost to writing Extinction Dream? And if so, what part of the story stayed with you the longest after it was finished?
So, yeah, I mean, each of my novels have had their own sort of emotional cost. Galatak, just for example, was written. I started it December 2020, and really, in a lot of ways, tonally, especially and atmospherically, it was just a vomit of the stress and paranoia of the sort of that. The most intense part of the COVID era, while also lots of other bad things were happening at the same time. That was an extremely chaotic and distressing year. And that's why, Galatak has the sort of pervasive, sort of ominous, foreboding tone to it. This one pulls from a lot of different parts of myself. If nothing else, again, I built in a whole subplot involving my Croatian heritage. I built in a lot of character deaths. In fact, characters that pulled parts from me. Actually, interestingly, I sort of designed Vetter from who I was in college. I was
you rapscallion.
I was a bit of a tech head, and I hung. I was a computer science major and a programmer. I worked in IT, and I actually lived with a couple of hackers who, later, I kind of realized later they were actually doing shit that I probably wasn't okay with. But I've since disconnected with them. But at the same time, yeah, he was somebody who sort of drew from parts of myself that I look back and I'm like, man, I was such an ass. But no, each character, I think, is always, each of our characters is always going to at least be to some extent an expression of ourselves. Either they're built directly from ourselves, or they're contrasted against ourselves, or they're drawn from our emotions about somebody that we know. And it's definitely a difficult part of writing horror, especially horror that's designed to get you at least somewhat attached or interested emotionally in the characters. And so, you have people like Markus's trio of friends on the station, Remy and Murakawa and Vetter. Then you have Casper, and then you have the friends down below. And, each of them, I spend a lot of time thinking about my characters. And so each of them actually does have, an investment of my emotional time and energy into them. And while I don't necessarily spare my characters from pretty dark fates, but at the same time, I don't always like doing it, and in this case, one of the things that I really did seek to do, and I'm not going to be specific here because it gets to the ending of the book, but, the ending itself, I was hoping that there would be some sort of reconciliation present there, where these differing, almost sort of mutually exclusive states of self that Markus is living in, where they are at least, they achieve a sort of equilibrium at the end of the book. And I was sort of seeking to have something of a, of a catharsis of the emotional investment that went into it.
Yeah, imagine if you have a character that you fleshed out pretty well, feel close to, and actually like as a person. If you then do something, not you do something, but write in some sort of a horrific ending or just something that they survive that's horrific, it's probably kind of like Markus when he's suffering those attacks where he's envisioning, beating his wife or cutting himself or something like that.
Well, there is a little bit of sort of the nature of the creative process in that, where, one thing I do, and, a lot of people will ask me things about like how I work on stuff. And I have a very iterative process where I most of my work is done. Like I do a lot while I'm driving to work on my morning and afternoon commutes. I do a lot while I'm washing the dishes or cooking dinner. And what I'm doing is I mentally run through recursions of the same scenes and just varying little details and sort of playing through how it would happen differently. So I do it especially with dialogue. It's one of my favorite ways to try to get what I hope is fairly natural dialogue. So when I'm thinking about things like character deaths, I do run through them repeatedly. I also think about character backstories and what would happen if the character had this dark element in their past, or what if they did this great thing in their past. And then, kind of mix and match them and get a sense for all these different iterations. And in a lot of ways, the way they sort of see these variations of their own history on the screens is kind of born from that same type of process. And I will say, to answer a part of your prior question that I didn't answer, there is one death about a third of the way through, maybe 40%. That one was the one that stuck with me the most. It's sort of during a convergence of a lot of action. It's during a particular combat engagement. And that one ends on a note that I was actually very reluctant to do because I really enjoyed writing the character that you say goodbye to at that point.
Yeah. Well, it was an amazing book, as are all of yours. So, listeners at home, buy it, read it, and review it. And you mentioned the characters that you write all having parts of you in them. Do people close to you ever recognize parts of themselves in your work, or do you completely keep your fictional world completely separate from your personal life?
So, nobody has ever recognized places that I've drawn characters from, and it's partially because I rarely base characters directly on somebody. The only exception to that is there's a character in Galatog named Brogden who is incredibly close to my uncle-in-law, especially his cadence of speech is entirely just straight up lifted from my uncle-in-law. And also the way he tells stories and talks about himself is very, very similar. But beyond that, I'm actually much more likely to create a character and be like, okay, so me and this friend did this thing. So I'm going to give that memory to this guy, but then me and this other friend did this thing, and he acted like that in that memory. So I'm going to take that from him and put it in this. And so I kind of, I create Franken characters by mixing and matching traits out of people that I know. And then, a lot of it is also just invention that I'm sure is somehow connected to memories and experiences I have, but I can't pinpoint them as clearly. But somebody might read one of my characters and be like, oh, hey, I recognize that place, or didn't we, play that game once or something like that. But you'll never get more than a fleeting moment unless you are my Uncle Tomislav, in which case, if you read Galatok, you'll definitely probably recognize yourself and maybe be mad about it.
Well, I've asked you about your book of poetry. You have two, is that correct?
Yeah.
So I think last time, one of the times you were on, you've been on a few times, I asked you about the first one, but then I saw you released one, I believe, in November of 24. So I haven't, I'm sure, asked you about that. The title is Fighting, is it Fermi?
Fermi.
Fermi.
Yeah, it's
okay.
Named after the physicist Enrique Fermi, who created the Fermi paradox, which is the idea that, on the one hand, statistically, we should have discovered aliens, that they're out there, and that they should be advanced enough that we'd be able to observe clear signs of their existence. But then also, we know we haven't. And so how do you reconcile that? Why is there no observable data? And of course, Fermi, there's been a lot of proposed answers to the Fermi paradox. People have answered it in all sorts of different ways. And actually in an Extinction Dream, my answer is that, if you might not even recognize or understand that the alien life is alive when you see it. It could be so different from ourselves that we wouldn't even understand that this is a living thing that we're encountering. But in Fighting Fermi, what I'm actually working with is one of the solutions to the Fermi paradox is the theoretical idea that there are what they call great filters, that in order for something to survive to the stage where they'd be observable from elsewhere in the galaxy or the universe, they would have to pass through a series of filters that are likely increasingly difficult to get past. So some of it's going to be like, evolving multicellular life. Some of it's going to be, terraforming the surface of your planet, making it into outer space, harnessing a source of energy that would get you beyond the boundary of your solar system. Basically, one of the most common arguments is that it's statistically likely that a lot of the early filters are relatively easy for planets to be able to pass, that there's a high likelihood that species simply either exhaust their planets or they destroy themselves before they reach that point. And so that's where the title Fighting Fermi comes from. It's actually about the mixed feelings one has bringing children into a world that, on the one hand, has these lofty aspirations of, trying to break free from our planet. We have a lot of high-flying valleys that are actually really wonderful. I think they're admirable. But at the same time, we're also just as likely to destroy ourselves before we get anywhere.
Well, that actually sounds, I've had poets on before, some of it dark, but not any with poetry that's got such a speculative technical bent to it. That sounds interesting. I'm going to have to check that out.
Oh, you're welcome to. I'm pretty proud of it. Poetry is always kind of this low-key endeavor. At least I haven't figured out how to market it on a big stage. But, I actually literally earlier today, I actually sent a poem off to a magazine looking for submissions that match what I was working on. And, it's one of those things I just kind of do for myself. And, I hope that, when I get it to other folk that they'll connect with it and find something valuable in it. And but at the same time, honestly, I also think it's got some of the trademark, Andrew Najberg stuff where, I do incorporate science and big ideas and I juxtapose it against the minutia of sort of day-to-day life. I don't know. That's just kind of how I think it's just part of how I roll at this point.
Well, so on a lighter note, how have the author cons been going?
Oh, they've been going fabulous. That was so cool because, first off, not only are they dressed as the Shining twins, but that's also Jamie Flanagan, who I got to be on a panel with about gaming and horror. And that was a really cool opportunity because they're a really interesting individual, and they were a great member of the panel. It was a lot of fun. But no, AuthorCon was fantastic. It was a really excellent experience. I got to meet and work with some really awesome authors while I was there. I got to share a table with my friend John Cohn, who's a fabulous author, and we are releasing a board game later this year together.
Nice.
Yeah, it's through a publisher called Beyond Killer Games. We're actually meeting about it on Friday. It's a game that I conceptualized and I laid the base design for, and then me and John have since collaborated on the mechanics, but it's called The Bad Side of Town. Every player is a serial killer, and you live in the bad side of town, and it's got 4 different neighborhoods. And, because you're all killing in the same place, you've reached this sort of tacit agreement with each other that you're just going to keep to your own neighborhoods. So everybody can kind of keep doing their business as they want. But at the beginning of the game, a new body has shown up that doesn't belong to you or any of your friends. And there's a new player in town who doesn't know the rules. And he is leaving bodies everywhere. And your goal is to simultaneously gather enough evidence to get him out of there while also keeping the police away from shutting the city down. And so it's a cooperative board game with a murder theme. You end up killing a lot of people, maybe even eating them. But it's been a lot of fun to work on that. But so that was a really cool part of AuthorCon, though, was getting to hang out with John. We've been collaborating about this game for over a year now, it's interesting because we talk every day, but or not every day, but a lot of days, and we've only met like once or twice. So it was really cool to have that opportunity. I view him as one of my good friends, but he's literally one of the people I've seen least that I, in that respect. But no, I'm about to do Books and Brews 2, which I'm really, really excited about. It is August 1st through 3rd in Indianapolis, or right outside.
I had Tiffany Copland on the show.
Oh, fantastic. She's delightful. She's done an amazing job building this event and hyping it up. She's brought some amazing people, including a special guest that I can't announce, but I'm super excited to meet. I think she's very talented at event creation and promotion. She's facilitated the building of a wonderful community in books of horror. She's created this sort of focal event that sort of coalesces both that community and the indie horror brawl as well. And I'm extremely excited about it. I'm going to be at a table that's specifically for Wicked House Publishing. And
shout out to Wicked House, hell of a publisher.
No, they're fantastic. I love working through them. 3 of my books are through them, and a 4th is under contract. Patrick Ruman, the owner and main operator, is I see him as just a friend of mine. We talk very frequently, sometimes about shop, and we've gotten to know each other well. And he's been a delight to work with. One thing I'll say about him, no matter what, is he never shorts the quality of the books. He cares very deeply about the books, about the authors, and about the reputation of the authors, and he's really, really willing to fight for that, and it's awesome. But yeah, and I'll be sharing the table with Blaine Daigle, Elizabeth DeVecchi, and William Gray, and Joe Scipione, and MJ Mars was supposed to be there, but she's...
everybody you've listed so far has been on the show because Wicked House Publishing is the shit.
I mean, really, like I have, almost, I probably have about 80% of the books, and the ones that I don't physically own yet, it's only because I haven't met the authors and been able to get their signed copies, because I'd rather do that with Wicked House. Otherwise, I have them all on digital file and have read nearly the entire catalog. Really, it's been a fantastic press to work with. I'm going to be hyping up, of course, Extinction Dream there. And weirdly enough, I actually have another book coming out next month.
What?
Yeah. So I have a middle grade fantasy novel called The Neverborn Thief. It came out through Olive Ridley Press, which is a subsidiary of Manta Press. And just through unfortunate circumstances, Olive Ridley ended up shuttering. And they have sort of been consumed by Manta, but at the time its fate was really uncertain. And so because I really wanted to make sure that book had a chance to reach audiences, I decided to move it to what is now Crystal Cove Entertainment, a new imprint of Crystal Lake Entertainment, run by Joe Meinhardt. And it's coming out July 22nd in a re-release. It's been beefed up a little bit. The original version was an MG book with an 11-year-old protagonist who has has now been aged up to 13. Because admittedly, Neverborn was a really dark book for 11-year-olds. I was definitely really trying to push on.
Don't coddle these kids. Let them.
Well, I really did push on boundaries for what would be, I think, digestible without guidance.
Okay.
And ultimately, I think books for middle grade. I think they're best used for creating dialogue among kids and their parents, kids and their friends, kids and teachers, and that kind of thing. But at the same time, I want the book to be able to land with the broadest audiences. And so I did. I wrote the protagonist to be 13 to better match the age of the things that he endures. And I didn't age him up a lot. I think the book is still emotionally challenging for a 13-year-old, but I think I sort of hit that right level, and I'm really excited to see how that's going to go. But that's I'm bringing that with me to Books and Brews too. So that's like a double event for me, because I'm going to be working to hype up 2 new releases, and I'm going to be sharing some space with some awesome folk, and some amazing folk are going to be in the same room with me. I know the author of Clown in a Cornfield is going to be there, Adam Cesar, Jonathan Jans, who has the forthcoming novel Veil, which looks really freaking good, is going to be there, and a number of other really cool people. Alma Katsu is going to be there, author of The Hunger, and so I'm really excited about that one. It's going to be a really cool event. Some people I greatly admire.
And who's the secret? Who's the secret?
Oh, it's sorry, yeah.
I thought if I just threw it in there,
Yeah.
No, didn't work. Sorry, people. Sorry, folks. Listeners at home, I tried.
But no, I mean, the events have been fabulous. It's a wonderful community, and there's just some amazingly dynamic folk.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, as always, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Oh, no, thanks so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Well, so as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you would like to plug, reiterate, in general, let your readers know about?
Well, I've got a pretty dense calendar, with July 22nd is the re-release of The Neverborn Thief. August 1st is the launch of Extinction Dream. August 1st through 3rd is Books and Brews 2 outside Indianapolis. August 6th, I'm going to be reading at Parnassus Books in Nashville with Megan Stockton. And then finally, in September, I believe it's the second weekend in September, I will be at Megan Stockton's TBR Con in Knoxville, Tennessee. So that's my big events for the calendar into the fall.
Nice. That's enough to keep us all busy. So we will be anxiously waiting with bated breath. So listeners at home, all links are in the description. And Andrew, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest authors and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.